The next Philosophy Portal course focuses on the concept and tradition of Christian atheism. Throughout the course, we will try to investigate the philosophical foundations of this notion, as well as articulate how this notion practically informs the modern history of philosophy. This will include analysis of transcendentalism in German idealism, political economy in Marxism, existentialism in Nietzsche, psychoanalysis in the Freudo-Lacanian tradition, the theology of Thomas Altizer, as well as investigations of living thinkers like Slavoj Žižek and Peter Rollins. The course will also include live guest contributions from Slavoj Žižek, Peter Rollins, Barry Taylor, and others. To get involved or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online. Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Mike Watson, and we're here to discuss his upcoming book, which will be released in September, and link will be in the description, to Hungry Ghosts in the Machine, Addiction, Digital Capitalism, and the Search for Self, which will be published through Revolt Press. Mike Watson's been described as the best Marxist thinker of the culture of data, and the intersection here and the working with both, let's say, communist theory or socialist theory, as well as the analysis of contemporary digital capitalism, is very much alive throughout this entire book. However, I think we should start with what I think is the central thread throughout the entire book, Mike, which is the topic of addiction and the nature of addiction, which is probably deeply connected here to the title Hungry Ghosts. So when you open up with this, I think, quite interesting idea from Jung, that addiction is a search for a type of low-level wholeness, and connecting that to the idea of hungry ghosts, what are you trying to communicate to us here?
Okay, I guess addiction resonates with me very strongly for various reasons, which we may unpack as we go. But let's say that I think there's been a lot spoken and written about how capitalism leads to depression. And I think that's been a really, strong moment in terms of recent critical theory, particularly with Fisher's capitalist realism, that we've got to speaking about how capitalism has an effect on mental health. I think that it's time maybe to broaden that conversation. So where it's generally been about capitalism leading to depression, I think that, it leads to depression and various other, how can we say, mental illnesses, personality disorders, and addiction, and also exacerbates the effects of neurodivergence, so ADHD and autism principally. I would say that the root of capitalism itself is addiction. I mean, you have to take quite a broad look at what addiction means to countenance this idea. Addiction in medical speak means, a literal physical dependence where you may become physically ill, as a result of the withdrawal of a substance that you have this compulsion to consume, such as alcohol. But there is a broader definition of addiction, which means basically anything that you have a strong compulsion towards, where you may feel, also mentally ill as a result of being deprived of that thing. So we tend to take this as pretty universally as the meaning of addiction, but there's still a kind of debate within medical circles whether you have to have that physical reliance or whether it's enough to have a mental reliance. So taking it to be, a broad kind of definition of addiction, I would say that capitalism has come about because we are basically addicted to a level of comfort that we're deprived of from early in childhood, if not from birth. So this arises because we cannot countenance our frailty, as beings, our mortality, and very early in our lives we get kind of taken away from the comfort of the very small family unit, the mother, perhaps even it goes back to the womb. We get taken away from that, and we're trying to constantly regain that. So you see this talked about in psychoanalytic theory. And for me, you get the situation where, you know, capitalism provides some kind of intermediary, so objects which you can consume to make yourself feel temporarily better, but they never give you enough. So you get caught in this cycle of needing, to consume again, whether that be McDonald's, or whether that be clothing items, or whether that be, digital objects, i.e. memes, YouTube videos, etc., or accumulating likes and friends and followers on social media platforms. So this is certainly something that's been exacerbated by digital culture. Although I will say I didn't write a book about the fact that we're all digital, we're all hooked to our digital devices or to social media. That's an important part of the book, but it's more, just the fact of addiction existing in digital culture, which I actually find, within a digital capitalist society, we're all basically addicted to various things. I think the idea that we're addicted to social media is kind of banal in this context. I think it's an addiction generally.
I mean, I've always been fascinated with the topic of addiction. I grew up in a lower class home, and I knew many people who, in my extended family, in my nuclear family, who not only struggled with addiction, but addiction led to disastrous, catastrophic consequences for them. Do you, how, I guess my question is, how do you think capitalism specifically conditions our addictions? And would you say there's a meaningful difference between the way addiction arises in 20th, 21st century capitalist society and perhaps pre-capitalist society?
Well, firstly, your experience sounds important and significant for our conversation, but I mean, just generally, one cannot discount the importance of coming from did you say a lower class background? I'm not quite sure how you described it, but an impoverished background,
Say a working class background.
working class background, where you've been, you've witnessed addiction, I guess, within your own family.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, I think. I mean, maybe that's one of the things that made Mark Fisher so important. And I know we had a bit of a Fisher moment in critical theory for a couple of years, and it's kind of like there's a feeling that is this perhaps overblown. But what he did is he kind of made it okay to speak about, your own life and your own mental health, as he spoke about his own mental health. And okay, as for the actual question about addiction under digital capitalism, I think it's just more relentless. I think if you didn't have anything to be addicted to before, if anyone can remember the 90s, and if you were able to stay addiction free at that point, if you didn't already have something that you were hooked on, you're more likely to be hooked now. There's just a speed of information coming at us that basically makes addiction unavoidable if you consider addiction to be a process of insecurity, grappling for an object which can kind of fill an emotional void in you, and then that object no longer, fulfilling that role. So then you need to go and find another one and another one. That this is a process that it has no end. The satiation in our era, the length of satiation, of being satiated by an object, I think is much smaller, because you may just think, you may get that moment of relief. You drunk your first beer in a pub on a Friday night, or whichever night of the week, depending, and you got that kind of, you sigh that relief, but actually you're not allowed to come off guard, because then there's your phone, and your phone's bothering you, whether or not it beeps or whatever. You may have turned the beep off, but you're kind of plugged into that, that mechanism which exists to tell you that you are not enough. There's something else you need to be thinking about. So there's this kind of constant web of information that we inhabit now. We totally inhabit capitalism as a force which, is there to tell us that you need this. No, that's not enough. You need this instead. So I think that's yeah, it's definitely worse today than it was some years ago. Yeah.
I think that one of the lines of analysis that I've come across a lot lately is a shift from thinking about lack to focus on excess, that we're drowning in excessive media, we're drowning in excessive images, we're drowning in excessive flow of information, and there's just this overabundance of crap. And none of it fills the hole, but it confronts us more and more deeply, perhaps, with this mechanism where addiction can grab hold of us and perhaps control our entire lives. I'm taken by your references to psychoanalytic theory, specifically the womb, and I was wondering how that might connect with an idea that you present in your book about addiction being closely related to the experience of boundarylessness, the experience of a loss of boundaries, that we have this bounded self, and that in addiction we're searching for some sort of state without boundaries. Do you think that that could connect to the psychoanalytic theory of addiction with the emphasis on a return to the womb?
Yeah, I mean the womb is one image. I suppose I'm just trying to place like at what point people no longer feel secure, and I think that you could say, well, there's a point in childhood where you realize that you're kind of basically alone, that your parents aren't always going to be there for you, and this kind of happens incrementally through your life. So it may be that there are sudden moments in which you come to a greater kind of sense of isolation or atomization. But I think this happens at different points for different people. So it's safe to assume that everybody has a similar experience of being born, or they may have actually different experience of of emerging into the world. But that's definitely a point we can trace in which we all suddenly lose a safety blanket, so to speak. We lose the safety of the womb. So it's a good analogy. Although I don't think it's the only point at which we lose that sense of security. I think it's a gradual thing. It happens in stages. I mean, it definitely comes into Freud, it comes into Lacan, and it comes into Jung. I guess it must come into many other analysts, if I'm to think. And it comes also into critical theorists such as Adorno and Marcuse. And actually, Marcuse, and to a lesser degree, Adorno, are very reliant on Freud in any case. I think what's important here is that we as humans, we try and feel more secure on a daily basis by trying to understand and compartmentalize and measure and name the world around us. There's a constant process of trying to control what's around us, and trying to distinguish between us as the individual I subject and the rest of the world as something else. And that's basically where all conflict comes from. And actually, I mean, it's hard to see how we could live without this mechanism. So it's a point of incredible frustration when you understand what's going on. And it is present. This is present in Hegel, for example. It's present in Marx and Adorno. But I think it's present, going back to the ancient Greeks. But we have the situation where we're definitely part of nature, yet we experience nature as being separate from nature. And if we didn't, we would kind of very quickly fail, because we need to get up and go and find food and have relations with other people, etc. So there is this thing that Adorno refers to as identity thinking, although it's already in Hegel as identity thinking and various other philosophers. But identity thinking means that we proceed in thought. Our thought processes are based on the ability to identify and categorize objects. And Adorno basically says, well, the problem there is that, well, for one, we can't actually accurately identify them. So we don't know if we're identifying something as red because it's red, something, as being a tree because it's really a tree. if you get into quantum mechanics and neurology and whatnot, it gets all very interesting. Although I'm not very qualified in this department, but I mean, I think it's quite clear to anybody who even dabbles in that kind of thing. And it also, you know, as people who think about philosophy, that the reality we're seeing might not actually be reality at all. Okay, so we're imposing some kind of web onto that reality. But aside from that, Adorno basically is pointing out that as long as we identify, then we're going to be constantly in conflict. So you get the situation where you're identifying, you know, other people as being different from you and inferior to you, and actually this is a form of projection onto the other. So, you know, I feel insecure in myself, so I start to say that this other foreign person is dirty, unclean, etc., because my main fear is of myself as dirt, because that's where we end up. We all end up returning back to the earth eventually. So Adorno basically says that this is an inadequate way of being, but we're always going to be blighted by this. We're not ever going to surpass this process of identifying. But he said we can have these moments where we temporarily lose our, and he talked about this happening via the experience of listening to classical music or watching certain types of theatre or looking at certain types of art. So you enter this moment of you enter this moment of loss, say loss in the music. So you're listening to a piece of music and you're no longer thinking about your day ahead. You're no longer worrying about yesterday. You're no longer thinking at all. Okay, so you kind of melt into the music, and we've all had this. It's probably the easiest example one can think of, other than if people have done if people have taken drugs, then certain drugs have an effect which is similar. So this is the kind of losing the edges that we aspire to. You know, we're happy when we lose our edges, and you know, I mean, it really happens. One of the only intelligent things that Jordan Peterson has said. Well, Jordan Peterson says actually intelligent things, but he says a lot of very stupid things. So you get a situation where, yeah, I know he's a victim of digital capitalism, definitely, and an addict. But the point is, he once said that, you know, look, people say drinking is illogical, and he said there's nothing logical about alcohol. It's like about the most logical thing you could do is have a drink, because it makes you feel good. I don't know how many people feel this, because not everyone likes drinking at all. I went to university in the 90s. I'm from England. Actually, I went to pubs from age 14 with older brothers, and that was good of them, because they introduced me to something that, you know, you need to be introduced to. Back then, you had to be introduced to pub culture to kind of thrive. And I just felt, you know, beyond the first drinks I had, even before that, I think at a party when I was 13 or so, beyond the first kind of excessive drinking moment I had, because it was introduced in the household in England, even before that often. But getting beyond the vomiting first stages, you know, the thing that I noticed was that you just feel so calm. You know what I mean? The only thing I've ever compared to that, being able to compare to quite the feeling of the first couple of drinks, is what do you call these? Ah, damn! It's like I think actually the thing that Peterson was addicted to. What do you call this genre of drug? This
Oh, benzos.
benzos. Yeah, very. I was once prescribed very mild benzos to come off drinking, and then got addicted to the benzos, and that was as bad as. And then the come down off the benzos was as bad as the come down of drinking, because we've jumped to quite a stage here. But I did have a period of drinking quite a lot in my life, and the thing is that, okay, people talk a lot about LSD, partly because Mark Fisher wrote this unfinished book called Acid Communism. But then people always talk about LSD, but you know, when they talk about it in relation to socialism, because you don't feel your boundaries, therefore maybe you can feel at one with everybody, but it's temporary. But you know, you don't have to go to the extreme of LSD, where your edges very literally disappear and you see colors everywhere and you float off maybe, and you know, and whatever. Even alcohol, you get that feeling of just calmness. I no longer feel threatened. So there's many ways of experiencing this. Now, Adorno crucially said you can experience this only temporarily, and this is a really important moment of what he called the shudder. Is you lose yourself in perhaps music, but at some point that ends. Either the music ends or you get interrupted in your kind of blissful moment, and that's the real shudder moment, the shock moment. And then you come back into yourself with a kind of, you know, you jump back into yourself, and then you realize what's just happened. Like temporarily, I was lost. I was one with everything. And it's an important exemplary moment, because it shows you that, you know, if that exists, you know, then maybe we can politicize that. Even Kant says something similar about experience of beauty and the sublime back in the late 1700s. And I think, with LSD, you have a similar thing. LSD, mushrooms, drinking, but of course, the come down of these things can be quite difficult. So I think you can kind of lose that moment of reflecting on what that can teach you, because you just get caught up in the kind of, well, literally the come down, the hangover with drinking. But yeah, going back to your question, yes, this loss of your edges is returning to a moment of security, either a moment of security that you had in childhood, or just a moment of security that you feel you may have once had. There's a nostalgia for a time without boundaries that needn't even have existed, but we definitely think that it should exist, partly because I think that's the flip side of the fear of death. We know we're going to die, and that's very scary, but also we know in actual fact we are part of everything. So even if you disregard the safety of the womb, whatnot, there is the fact of reality of existence is that there are really no boundaries. The boundaries are false. So I think that's partly why we're constantly trying to reach a point of boundlessness.
That was brilliant. And I really have an affinity with the principle of Mark Fisher's work in terms of linking the personal to the philosophical and opening up the personal to the philosophical. I think it makes the philosophical much richer. Far from particularizing it, I think it opens us to a new dimension of singular universality. And I think that that dimension of singular universality is absolutely crucial to any political emancipatory moment or any political emancipatory effort. So I appreciate you going into that much detail with the response. There's a joke or a meme that I came to mind while you were sharing your story, which is it was this line that said, "Alcoholism is the transition stage between capitalism and communism." It's just like that's a pretty accurate description in terms of what I've seen in my family and what I've seen in my extended networks. And perhaps it is trying to get towards this form of wholeness, this form of boundarylessness that we could get to via other paths like benzos or like other drugs. But I'd want to make this distinction that you make at the beginning of your work, inspired by Jung, with addiction being a kind of low level wholeness or an attempt to wholeness through a low level versus the possibility of wholeness through a higher level, which might be like you're referring to with the Kantian notion of beauty and the sublime with music and being transported, as it were, to a loss of your boundaries, transported to a loss of yourself through that immersion in music. And how are we to understand, in your view, the relationship between this highest and the lowest? It seems like a tremendously important dimension because I think it's something we all struggle with.
Yep. Well, yeah, I mentioned Jung there in the book, and I think he kind of pervades the book, although maybe he's mentioned twice or so, perhaps three times, I'm not sure. I actually did do a period of did undergo a period of Jungian therapy, so that was very much on my mind. So for Jung, it would be a case of trying to reach individuation. So you can have this sense of being at ease with things and feeling at one with the kind of outside world when you drink or take other substances, or through sexual encounter, or perhaps through sport, and there's various other ways of achieving that, but it's not going to last. Okay, so it's like with Adorno, with the experience of art, it's going to come to an end, and then you're going to be left thinking, what was that, and perhaps trying to work out how to regain that. And then that's where not for Adorno but more for Jung, because Adorno didn't really speak about addiction, but that's where the addiction would come in for Jung and for various other theorists and psychoanalysts. Now, yeah, so there are ways of trying to make this process, last longer. Okay, or it's a different process in reality. Now, I think the thing here is that you have in trying to counter death, you have the death of consumerism, as in the death we experience via consumerism, which is one of us becoming objects, which Marx describes very well. So through our relationship to capitalism as workers or as consumers, we end up either becoming objects as workers, becoming objects, in a factory or other kind of setup, other capitalist setup, or becoming objects in that we buy products because we want the products to work in our favor. So you buy the new shirt to make you more attractive, or you buy an iPhone because that's somehow going to improve your life, but you end up being kind of led by the object. So this is described in Marx's Capital Volume 1, that there's some kind of process whereby it's the object that becomes subject and you become object enthralled to the subject. Sorry, you become hang on, it's confused. Yeah, anyway, you become led by the object. And so there's that process. So you're fearing death. You're like, how can I somehow stop worrying for a moment about all of the kind of things that could be a threat to me? And the fear of death is not often very direct, like, literally, I fear death. Although for many people, this is a daily thought at least. But often it's more just a vulnerability. So you go into how can I kind of stop thinking about all the ways in which things can go wrong. Okay, so you buy something, or you engage in online activity. So you start looking at memes, then you make a meme, then you post a meme, and then you're like looking for the likes. So the likes coming in, am I getting more followers? And so in your kind of like wanting to be intensely alive and certainly not wanting ever to be dead, you're looking at the screen, and what you become, you're frozen more or less, apart from some hand gestures in front of a computer screen or on your phone. So in evading death, in all your greatest efforts to evade death, you become this kind of ossified being controlled by these objective images, this matter, because even digital images are basically matter of some kind. They're materially construed. So that's one form of losing yourself in the object, and that can be contrasted. That kind of death through consumerism can be contrasted to ego death, which I talk about a little bit in the book. And ego death was a term that Timothy Leary talked about in the 60s. Leary was a big advocate of LSD, but it's a term that finds its parallel in many kind of religious codes and spiritual codes, like Buddhist nirvana. So it's a process by which you let go of, or literally of the ego, of yourself as that thing that thinks that you are a specific individual persona, or personality rather. And I talk about that being, to some degree useful, but how that isn't entirely sustainable, and also about how that's been commodified. So you'll get people telling you, on YouTube videos, YouTube, spiritual YouTube and spiritual Insta, you'll get people basically selling you how you too can achieve ego death. So the whole thing becomes somewhat farcical. But there are still people who seriously engage with these things, and I have no doubt that ego death exists, but it's generally transient. So you will experience some kind of ego death. So I often talk about tripping. I don't actually take any substances anymore, should we say, but I know that a lot of the audience, when you get into these conversations, are like, they wanted to hear about LSD, they wanted to hear about smoking pot and about taking peyote and DMT and what have you. So I tend to mention that, but there are other ways, via meditation, for example, or psychosis, or some other kind of mental health shock, where you experience a situation in which you no longer feel yourself to be the false personality that you have created, which is either a stable personality that you very much adhere to, and you're sure that's you, or it's a series of fluctuating personalities. But the point is, with ego death, you lose the pretense to to having this fixed identity, and that is the kind of identity that identifies nature and objects, and categorizes things, and therefore creates conflicts. So you lose that. But how do you make that useful on a Monday morning? So you've had your ego death moment, perhaps through drugs, or you've had some other encounter, and then you're thrust back into the workplace, and you're no longer experiencing ego death. So my point really in the book is that neither of these things, the death through consumerism to evade the actual death that's going to come anyway, or ego death, neither of these two polarities are actually going to provide a lasting solution, and certainly not a political solution. So of course none of us probably imagine consumerism is going to lead to a political solution, unless you're some kind of arch neoliberal. But on the other hand, with ego death and other experiences where suddenly you feel at one, people are like, you know, I've had this experience, therefore I believe we can have a communist society. And it's, I hate to say naive, it's probably not the fairest word to use, but it's deeply flawed as a way of thinking. Now, I think that you can have moments of breakthrough through psilocybin, mushrooms, and LSD, and other drugs. There are also MDMA therapies, with a shaman or with a doctor. But it just simply, there aren't the resources to roll this out on a societal level. But I actually think this is probably the most useful thing that drugs could give us. Like, if somebody has depression, they can't quite locate the source of the ongoing depression, then they take LSD with a responsible minder, and that person does some kind of regression so they can look into their childhood, and they discover some kind of moment which helps them then move on. They recall something that helps them move on. And that kind of example, I think, that tells us maybe how this can be useful. And then the ego death, great. Well, if you can achieve that somehow and you can learn from it, then good. But I think maybe there's been a bit of an over reliance or some kind of imagining that we could weaponize LSD in the last few years, because Mark Fisher's unfinished Acid Communism, the introduction exists online and in compendiums, because that's been badly misread, basically, or we imagine it's been misread. The book wasn't finished, but I don't think that's what Fisher intended.
I would love to get into this topic, and I just want to say that I do have some experience working in the psychedelic community, working with psychedelic communities and experimenting with psychedelics myself. And one of the reasons why I'm no longer experimenting there or working there is that I did kind of feel like the entire culture was a little bit unreflective about the level of digital capitalism. And I like your emphasis that while, let's say, ego death is possible, let's say these peak experiences are legitimate, they at the same time do not offer a permanent or a social solution to our political conditions, specifically in the context of either neoliberalism or digital capitalism. And that actually functions as a pretty good transition moment into discussing what you just mentioned, Mark Fisher's Acid Communism, and specifically throughout the book. Not only do you reference Fisher's Acid Communism, but specifically some notions of limit experience that Fisher is pointing towards in acid communism in terms of how I understand your engagement with that text. So maybe first, what's the connection between, let's say, the Hungry Ghost realm and the possibilities of acid communism? And moving on from there, what do you think is the way we should be interpreting Fisher's acid communism?
Okay, so the Hungry Ghost is a reference to Tibetan Buddhism, and in Tibetan Buddhism, there's an image, a diagram, we could say, kind of almost mandala-like, a circular diagram, called the Wheel of Life. We call it that in English, and I think it's put on the doors of temples. In fact, I have understood it's put on the doors of temples, of Tibetan Buddhist temples, and it's kind of an educative tool. Okay, and it's kind of like, the first thing you see if you go there and you're not already schooled in Tibetan Buddhism. So then you will look at this diagram, and you will start to understand that basically within this diagram, it has many different stages. You have the kind of stages of rebirth, death and rebirth. So it's Tibetan Buddhism is a code in which they believe in reincarnation and karma. So you behave in a certain way, and you're going to be reincarnated at a higher level. Otherwise, you may be reincarnated at a lower level. So the Hungry Ghost is, if I recall, somewhere between somewhere between hell and being in hell and being human. But there are stages between that. I believe it's between animal and human, if I'm right. Unless it's between hell and animal. Anyway, it's a stage which is lower than human, and that the Hungry Ghost is a ghost which is kind of consigned to kind of haunt, to be bodiless, and to seek nourishment. The hungry ghosts, the figure of the hungry ghosts, if you see pictures, they have very small mouths and kind of pot bellies, like emaciated people, and the pot belly being something you see with emaciated people. And they're just constantly looking for well, physical nourishment, but actually that's more a metaphor for spiritual nourishment. So that's why it's a good I think it's a good metaphor for today, where we're all never quite satiated. So we're like these hungry ghosts, looking exactly for some kind of spiritual nourishment. And so Mark Fisher's acid communism, I wouldn't say directly relates. That does come into my book. So the essay Acid Communism, Fisher talks about how there are periods historically, and he refers particularly to the 60s and 70s, where the baby boomers, the generation born just after World War II, grew up, and then they led kind of social revolutions, big advances in women's rights, for example, and there was generally a kind of movement towards acceptance of difference, although nothing like what we've seen recently. There was still a lot of bigotry, but Fisher says, more than anything, that you had a time in which there was this experimentation with LSD and with Eastern mysticism, and this kind of seeped into mainstream culture. So in the UK, you had kind of these very bizarre TV programs, particularly on the BBC. He refers to something called Sapphire and Steel and to Doctor Who, and just the way in which you had like a very weird aesthetic that was getting into the mainstream. But you also saw it in fashion, but you also heard it in the music that was played on the radio. So the radio, you were constantly getting this kind of this music that very clearly was very beholden to hippie culture, to beatnik and hippie culture. And he said there was also a kind of blurring of class boundaries, people having incomes for the first time that made them, feel, perhaps independent of their job role. This is paraphrasing. And yeah, he talks about the limit experience. So crucially here, the limit experience is something that Foucault borrows from Bataille, and then Fisher speaks about this. But it's an experience where you, as we discussed earlier, you no longer feel your edges, but it's something that you can achieve in many different ways. So I think Fisher talks about that there, and he talks about the fact of the working class feeling somehow empowered. He talks about the general erosion of boundaries, because he's saying this isn't just about LSD. So it seems very clear to me that acid communism, I mean, it's a great term, but Fisher even says that acid, it has multiple meanings, but it's above all about an erosion of fixed identities, of boundaries. So LSD does that, but then the acid that corrodes, the substance, liquid that corrodes, this also clearly it kind of destroys boundaries. So I guess I'm all for that in the book. That's my main point of discussing that I'm all for that. But I'm very clear that I don't think it was ever supposed to be principally about psychedelics.
I think that it's clear that you, while engaging with the notion of acid communism, at the same time put a little bit of a skeptical or reflective distance to it. Do you think that it needs to be reinterpreted in the 21st century? Do you think that we should still engage with it and try to figure out how to extend that project? Or do you see yourself more pointing in a different starting point away from Mark Fisher?
I think that, I mean, for me, one of the main things in the book was, is to confront this idea of mortality that we don't deal with very well. And I don't think we're solving anything until we've addressed that. And that is really about our relationship with nature. Okay, with nature being the exterior object. So, when you talk about subject being I, and object being everything outside me, you're really talking about, an I which feels itself to be separate from nature versus nature. And this is very much how we think on an ongoing basis. And it's apparently how we think more in the West than it is, a way of thinking in other societies. Although, we're doing a very good job of making other societies more and more resemble us. So we risk a situation in which we kind of stamp out cultures which are more at one with nature. So, I'm not saying we have to get into like a death worship or even a constant kind of thinking around death. It's just that it's always already there. You know, our relationship with nature, our oneness with nature is always already there, although our faculties somehow keep this removed from us. But also, you know, the fact of our death is always there. You know, that it defines how we live. You know, we're very much conscious of mortality, but at the same time, we don't deal with it directly at all. So the book actually it uses this phrase. Actually, talk about the phrase socialism or death. This phrase that people always attribute to Che Guevara, but it was used by a great many more, many other people in the Spanish language, where I don't actually speak Spanish. So I did it on another podcast at some point, and I regretted it. But there is this socialism or do you speak Spanish? Muerta. But anyway,
I don't know.
socialism or death, but in Spanish. But anyway, that's where we get it from. It was a phrase used in South America by communists. So anyway, I think we're all familiar with the phrase socialism or death. So basically, it means, you know, I would rather have socialism. I'd rather live. You know, I would rather. How do you say it? I would rather. It's the same thing. I would rather live on my feet, or is it? I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knee. I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. So this socialism or death basically expresses the same thing. And of course, I think it's a reasonable statement. You know, if you want to get into revolutionary politics of that kind, although I don't think that's entirely appropriate or opportune in the current political moment in the West. Anyone, you know, trying an armed insurrection in America or the UK, etc., is going to be up for a rude awakening. But yeah, you know, I understand the sentiment of socialism or death. I understand the revolutionary sentiment. But you know, what I'm saying is that actually a more accurate phrase would be socialism and or death, and stroke or death. Because I think the key to socialism, the key to us achieving that is to embrace nature, and therefore to embrace the fact of our death instead of constantly fighting it. So, you know, we fight death by trying to create ever more comfortable situations materially. Okay, so you work really hard, so then you get a mortgage, you buy a house, then you buy a bigger house, you buy multiple houses, you buy cars, you get servants, you get, now who are the servants? They're people that, you know, if the shit hits the fan, they're gonna protect you possibly. So we know we find these ways to control things around us, resources. So that's the house that we buy, other people. So there are servants, there are workers, etc. And then you're also controlling natural resources. So, you know, this, you can see how this leads to conflict. People want each other's resources. People want ever more resources for themselves. So, you know, it really is an issue of, you know, if you were not so scared of death, you wouldn't be accumulating this stuff in the first place. So that's where I say that, you know, the phrase should be socialism and or death, because it's like the or death is like, well, I'd rather, you know, I want to live socialist if I'm going to live at all. Yeah. So, okay, I understand that. But that's not going to be through eradication of death. That's going to be, you know, precisely through a pact with nature. That's one way of putting it, which is somehow more friendly to most people's ears. But I would say that what you're really dealing with a pact with nature is a pact with mortality, because that's the aspect of nature that we're fighting.
It really is a struggle, and the first place it brings me to, and it brought me here while I was reading it as well, in regards to coming up with this pact with nature or this pact with mortality, is how do you conceive of the relationship between, let's say, socialism or death and any relationship with religion or spirituality in regards to emancipatory politics? Do you think that there should be more interface between religion and emancipatory politics, or do you conceive of emancipatory politics in the socialist direction as something that's much more naturalistic, much more atheistic, without any relationship to religion?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's one that you can ask, partly because it's not in the book, but I'm glad the book raises that issue. This is a very difficult question, I think, because there's a kind of natural, well, not really natural, but historical split between religion and socialism. And I think there's reasons to be critical of organized religion. But I think it doesn't hurt to have some kind of spiritual code, even if that be highly individualized. By that I mean, your own exploration of existence, what that means to you, and of a symbol system which can help you to navigate that. So, this is kind of what a spiritual system is. The symbol systems that we are drawn to, I don't think are very healthy. And I think that's one reason why we suffer in today's society, and is made worse by a symbol system today that, just bombards you with rubbish, i.e., memes and internet culture and advertising. So yeah, I think it is really important that, in terms of getting a grasp on our lives, being mature, being being beings worthy of socialism, that we that we do confront, honestly, the conditions of our existence, not hide from it, not put our old people away in homes, not, somehow be absent where the death is present. It's important that we confront this, and that we do it, with a kind of system in place, with symbols in place that can aid that. Because I don't think you can do that without symbols, because we work with symbols and narratives. So I say symbols, but we can incorporate narratives also into that. And I think that can be something you go through with an analyst, or some other kind of analyst, or a shaman, or perhaps in a friendship group or support group. I actually don't think it's that useful for it to be a religion that, where there's one code and that's your symbols, and then someone leads that. I think we need, networks where we can help each other go through that. And that's something that clearly isn't present within socialism. No, within socialism and anarchism, I think that people generally can be quite against spirituality. And there's a strange thing happening where there's a kind of weird esoteric kind of meme tendency that is coalescing around the right wing, and I find it worrying that they have something like that and we don't have any counter to that. And I think all that really does is it's people appropriating esoteric imagery of various kinds to try and make themselves feel mysterious, and to somehow perhaps even frighten other people. So it's a form of edgelordism, and I don't think we should be approaching that at all on the left. But yeah, we certainly need something.
I'm quite taken by the observation that many left-wing oriented political movements like anarchism and socialism might be lacking a theological or a spiritual ground, whereas people on the right wing seem to, whether it's authentic or not, appropriate this imagery and perhaps have an advantage in terms of community organizing and long-term identification with things like religion. Do you think that something that you're pointing to with Mark Fisher's work, acid communism, perhaps also Jungian analysis, is trying to recreate a different type of religion or a different type of spirituality? Or does it interface at all with the more atheist-leaning spiritualisms and socialisms?
The next Philosophy Portal course focuses on the concept and tradition of Christian atheism. Throughout the course, we will try to investigate the philosophical foundations of this notion, as well as articulate how this notion practically informs the modern history of philosophy. This will include analysis of transcendentalism in German idealism, political economy in Marxism, existentialism in Nietzsche, psychoanalysis in the Freudo-Lacanian tradition, the theology of Thomas Altizer, as well as investigations of living thinkers like Slavoj Žižek and Peter Rollins. The course will also include live guest contributions from Slavoj Žižek, Peter Rollins, Barry Taylor, and others. To get involved or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online.
Yeah, I don't know what Fisher had in mind there with acid communism. I think acid communism as a kind of meme movement, and there's definitely been, kind of meme movement. There is an online movement. I mean, the acid communist Facebook page, I don't know how many followers it has now. I think last time I looked, I think it has 50,000. I ran an acid left page for a while, and a YouTube, which I've actually renamed those pages quite recently. because I found that somehow limiting. But yeah, there's been a small online movement, sizable but small online movement, and you get spiritual references come up quite a lot on those pages. So that link is being made for sure. Yeah. If you look at what Fisher proposed, I mean, he kind of pointed to festival culture, and he talked about the need for I don't remember the exact word he used right now off the top of my head, but you know, kind of support networks and learning networks, kind of an activist culture, a community center. You know, when you get activists that make community centers that provide something, like the Black Panthers famously provided breakfast for deprived kids. You know, this kind of thing. I think this is what Fisher's pointing at, and I think that can fulfill what I was talking about earlier of people supporting each other in developing symbol systems that can help them make sense of their lives. So for me, yeah, that is very much about that. Although I don't know how much we can move forward with the term acid communism, you know, generally is how much the left can take that forward. It hasn't achieved a lot, and I think its moment was kind of coming out of COVID, and that's like, you know, I think there was a moment of enthusiasm then for acid communism, but also you thought, well, we're all suddenly going to come out of lockdown. Something has to emerge from this. There must be like a hunger for community, and after this moment, in this terrible moment for many people, that was emotionally draining, and you know, it led to ill mental health for many people. You know, surely we're going to come together and try and create a moment, you know, a political movement that involves community and perhaps well-being. And then nothing happened. It just kind of, there was talk maybe about this, and there was talk about, let's stop commuting, you know, 500 miles, a thousand miles on planes to go to conferences and art shows and whatever, and let's lead a more simple life. And then it didn't happen, didn't materialize. You just got you got a whole lot of other things. You got the rise of the far right to a greater degree even than before, and you got the Ukraine conflict and now Gaza. But then there are some protest movements against Gaza, which are encouraging in many senses. But you know, I don't know that. All I'm saying is the acid communism moniker. I don't know how far we can run with it. You know, also because it has the word acid and the word communism in it. You know, so somehow you're losing a big audience, and then you're losing another big audience. You know.
Yeah, it's perhaps something that could be alienating to both the psychedelic community and the more socialist leaning community. There are a lot of people on the socialist end of the spectrum that I think don't want anything to do with the psychedelic end of the spectrum, and certainly people in the psychedelic community that would have some sort of resistance or perhaps intellectual distance and practical distance from Marxist theorization. But maybe let's play with some of your other influences. I know throughout the book you're using figures like Adorno, Deleuze. We already discussed Fisher. We already discussed Jung. You also mentioned Jung, Roderick, and Sontag. How do some of these other influences influence your point of view, and what are they contributing to your overall thesis in regards to hungry ghosts and digital capitalism?
Okay, good question. Yeah, there's a fair few people in there. It's kind of like I'm more presenting a thesis, and then you know there's people that I'm kind of, you know, it's like I have a smorgasbord of, you know, of different people, and they come in where it's useful. I mean, I mean Adorno is quite a sustained, actually is quite a sustained focus on Adorno in a couple of different points, and it's quite critical. I mean, Adorno I think is really interesting in the way he spoke about popular music, and he has this idea of dissonance, and dissonance is one means of achieving this kind of, you know, loss in the music, and then this kind of sudden shock, and then you come out of that moment of being absorbed in the music, you suddenly come out of that and you're thrown back into yourself, and you have to try and work out what this means that you momentarily lost yourself. Dissonance, this musical dissonance, which is principally achieved when you have two notes that are very close to each other, so a semitone apart, if you play two notes a semitone apart, they vibrate intensely and you get a kind of slightly jarring sound. So this dissonance is really important. And Adorno talks about dissonance occurring in Schomburg's music, in Gustav Mahler's music. So these were modernist classical composers, but he detests popular music. He doesn't see any potential in this, and he actually talks about the Beatles in a derogatory way, whereas Fisher was very pro 60s and 70s music and psychedelic music. So I talk about why that might be, and actually I argue that what Adorno may have missed, that the Beatles in their heavier moments were basically presenting dissonance for a kind of popular modernist period, and that can actually have its uses. And I get into actually how Metallica can be seen in that way, and it's more about the rhythm for Metallica rather than the dissonance, although that's also there. But this kind of like constant chugging of metal music, that kind of emulates addiction. You're going round and round. And the thing there is that one can imagine there might one day be an off ramp. So this going round and round of addiction is kind of is akin to how trauma cycles. But the important thing about cycling trauma is that if you go through a process with an analyst, that you in experiencing the trauma again and again, you can start to put a slightly different spin on it. You can start to kind of spin the narrative slightly differently, so you might eventually escape that. And that's in fact how I refer to Deleuze. And Deleuze talks about the refrain and this kind of repetition. Obviously he's famous for the book Difference and Repetition, and that's partly his point there as well. So there's a couple of ways in which I use different theorists. And then Roderick, he just said some things about addiction that I found very powerful. Rick Roderick, who is famous for making tuition videos, so he was like the granddad of the online left, the YouTube left. I think he actually he recorded lectures for videos that were then sold to the public. But at a time when you got university education, or otherwise you weren't involved in critical theory at all. So there were people who were able to get these videos, and go through some of these concepts, philosophical concepts that Roderick was talking about. So I just find the figure really important. I would love to write a full-length book on him, but it just wasn't materializing. I ended up incorporating some of my thoughts about Roderick into this book, but he does actually say what I actually quote. One of the things I quote from him is that look around and ask yourself, who isn't, of your friends, who isn't on some kind of 12-step program right now? Meaning by the 12-step program, he means Alcoholics Anonymous type programs. And I paraphrase that, and I can't find the exact quote right now. But I think today you could say a similar thing. But look around and ask yourself, certainly, who isn't somehow suffering, today. But partly as a result of digital capitalism, which of your online contacts is not somehow suffering, but probably as a result of being online. And that's not exactly what I say, but the book does make that point, that the thing with the online realm is it creates a problem for us. It hooks us, it gets us addicted. It can also cause anxiety and depression. And then we have a tendency to go online to find a solution for the problem that's being created by the online realm. And you see that a lot with well-being pages on Instagram and YouTube, etc. Yeah, so that's just a few. I mean, just coming off you asking me to talk about a few theorists. Yeah.
No, yeah, that's great, and I think it would be a real treat to have a full book done on Roderick. I think in terms of literature, he's perhaps someone who's overlooked, because while I think you're correct to say he's a big influence to a lot of people in the online left, I don't know how much literature has been written about him. So if you ever do write that project, I'd be very interested to read the results of it. And just how you're ending there with this basic sentiment that who isn't struggling with the online world today, and this loop where some sort of issue that's caused by our online life is, people try to search for a solution that's being caused by the symptom of the situation in the first place. I get the sense when I read your book that you're pushing towards a view of looking for solutions in nature or looking for a different type of connection to nature? Is that pointing in the right direction? Or do you see some other solution in the mix here? Do you think basically we should be spending much less time online and developing more of a life in relationship to nature? I know you mentioned, for example, when you thought acid communism was having its moment during Corona, that people would start to live a more minimalist life, start to disconnect from the matrix. Do you still sort of embody that principle yourself, or do you see that motion in your own life?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we connect to nature somehow. I don't know if I could like devise a program of how that's done. I think it's enough to say that we need to get offline. I mean, at points, I mean, I have on my phone now an app blocker that I rely on. In the morning when I wake up, I can't actually get on to various sites, social media sites and other sites. And in the evening, it kicks in about 11 p.m. And I found that very useful. And that's, that's an obvious thing that anyone can do. I mean, I think it costs me some money, but there are also various free options. But I mean, aside from that, yeah, I mean, I think being close to nature can mean very many things. I mean, I do like to go for a cycle ride and whatnot. I mean, I live in Finland, so I'm fairly fortunate. We have great cycle paths and we have some good relationship with nature. I mean, I think 80% of Finland is forest, and I don't know how many lakes there are, but it's in well over 100,000 lakes here. But I mean, it's not just a case of saying we need to get outside. I mean, that's fairly banal. I'm sure you'll agree, and it's no basis for a movement. I mean, it could be, but you have to have many other things in place apart from the just going and being in nature. I think it's also about how do we stop conflicting with nature, and in that sense of nature is the other, we're fighting the other, and we're doing that by trying to subjugate one another, and trying to subjugate natural resources. But I think also it's in a mentality. Okay, so if the capitalist is somebody who's subjugating natural resources to try and accumulate as much wealth as possible, to try and empower themselves to fight off the threat of death, which of course is the certainty of death. What is the online content creator, for example? Let's look at ourselves. I mean, I rarely make podcasts. I make one a month now for Revolt Press. You make a podcast called Theorize and Be Damned. I have made a lot more content in the past. I mean, even the term content is interesting, because you could say I made a lot more art, but I think there's a reasoning behind this, why we've been encouraged now to call this content, because it strips it of any kind of, sense of creativity or something contrary to capitalist tendency to create wealth or something that is numerically countable. Whereas content sounds something very much that, it sounds like something that is numerically countable. But in any case, we're trying to further. Also, meme producers. I make a lot of memes actually. Revol Press has a meme account, Revol_press on Instagram. So I'm complicit in this. Well, what are we doing? We're trying to produce images, produce text, produce videos to try and further our position. And it gets very much about, well, how many viewers did I get? How many followers did I get? And you can get really trapped in that. One can get really trapped in that. When I was running the Acid Left YouTube with Adam Ray Adkins, we got quite stressed at a point. We were just trying to do something because we wanted to get out these good vibes, talking about books. We did reading groups. We would do reading groups where people who would come on and talk about, say, The Dialectic of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer, would also produce a meme or other artwork. And that was a really nice kind of project. And it was supposed to be totally unpretentious and not, hierarchical. We're not like, hey, we know about all this stuff, and you guys, you small guys out there, you're not as smart as we are, and that's important. That's what a lot of producers are doing now. They're really breaking down the boundary where you used to have the professor on a pedestal and the kids who weren't as smart as the professor, who were very much kept in their place. It's great that's being broken down, but it's very hard to avoid a concern for your figures. Like you go into that with the best intentions, and then you're like, well, how do I get the figures up? Last video did great because we talked about Adorno and Trump. so what do we do next time? How are we going to make this relevant? How are we going to make this so you end up playing to something that you don't want to be playing to at all, especially if you're kind of Adornian. I follow a Theodore Adorno. I mean, I've done a lot of work around Adorno, and I agree with a lot of what he says. To kind of be, following Adorno or Hegel or somebody or Marx, and then be, hey, it's got to be about the numbers. How do we get more viewers? Is a really tough thing. So, I mean, being more about nature can be about undoing the alienating effects of capitalism. So, where you've been alienated from nature, how do you reverse the alienation? It doesn't necessarily mean you have to go outside and put your bare feet on the ground. Actually, I quite like doing that, but it also means, how do you take a step back and make it more about building a community, which can mean in your locality. But I mean, it offers something. It really offers something where you can reach out to people across the world. So we have a network now where I'm speaking to you. We haven't met before, but you spoke to Bram Gieben, who I speak to regularly, and he's recently been speaking to the guys from This Is Revolution, who I also recently spoke to a couple of years ago. So there's something happening here, which is good. But how do we make it? How do we optimize that? Now, at the end of the book, I have this book that gets gradually kind of darker towards the end, and in the last chapter called literally Socialism and/or Death, and then there's an excursus. So an excursus in the book is a section of the book that's set slightly aside. I could have called it an afterword, but I kind of like this excursus. It kind of felt more like a kind of split from the rest of the book. So, you get all this kind of speaking about death, and actually the book wasn't supposed to have as much death in it as it does, but then a good friend died. He's about the same age as me, so in his 40s, and it was kind of tragic. And then that got me thinking. It got me putting a little bit more of that content that I suppose it is content, yeah, a little bit more death content in than I otherwise might have. But then at the end of the book, I bring something else in, and I start talking about live streaming and live streaming communities, and end on a note that, what would it be like, basically, to paraphrase, and I can even actually directly quote, picture us interviewing or performing for one another in pairs and small groups with intimate audiences, showing friends what we know. It would be like every decade and century prior to our own. It might facilitate conversation, empathy, and non-performative, non-competitive feedback. Above all, it would involve a sense of community. To appropriate Marx, we have nothing to lose but our audiences. So basically, what would it be like if we were doing this just on a very kind of humble, sharing level? And that would be, in a sense, in itself, getting back towards nature. So that's why I end on that, because I think that is one of the solutions. How do we dial this back, basically?
I was actually gonna bring that up in my next point. I had that as one of my favorite notes of your book is we have nothing left to lose but our audiences. And I wanted to ask that because maybe we could go into a little bit the contradiction that I feel is at work here if we get more reflective about these processes, because like you mentioned, there's kind of an emerging network. It's not really too well integrated. There are just various loosely connected associations. Like you mentioned, Brammy Gieben, I had him on the channel a few months ago, and I also know Jason from This Is Revolution, and there are many other various characters in these loosely connected networks. But it has to be said that all of these actors are acting in the context of digital capitalism, and we all have our audiences, and we're trying to participate in something that expands beyond small scale local communities that have no connection to a digital interface. And if we didn't have these online platforms, if we weren't trying to reach out to the digital, then there's a high probability we'd never even know about each other in the first place. So how should we think through this contradiction? I mean, practically speaking, I think that I'll probably continue doing the work I'm doing, but at the same time, one of the principles I'll share is that my work is always deeply connected to what I call a physical and digital loop. So I think that it's really important that we maintain the virtual dimension of our work, but we also take the extra time and energy or to reference David McCarriker's notion of time energy, we take the time energy to build physical events and to get together in person and to design the types of, whether they're conference spaces, whether they're gathering spaces, whether they're retreat spaces, some sort of physical space where we can perhaps approach this issue of the estrangement from both nature and community, and thinking about both of these things in a unity. How do you think about these things?
Well, I agree with that, or certainly they're the right questions. Yeah, I mean, meeting up in real life is a great thing. You know, meeting up in real life with people that has a different thing online. But having said that, I mean, you're not going to necessarily go and find somebody to speak about the things we've been speaking about right now. You know, you're not going to go to the supermarket and find somebody, or you're going to get arrested if you try, you know, pouring this all out on the first person you find in the street. So, you know, you can't underestimate the importance of the internet. Obviously, you know, with niche subjects, you're not going to have many people immediately around you who want to speak about that subject. So the internet has done a great service to critical theory and philosophy, and suddenly, you know, there's tens of thousands of people wanting to know about Adorno. I mean, this was unimaginable. I mean, there were, of course, that many people who were to some degree engaged in reading about Adorno, but the constant kind of, you know, presence of thousands of people who will respond to an Adorno meme, an Adorno YouTube video, you know, same with Hegel, Marx, whoever. I mean, this is an incredible breakthrough, without a doubt. Yeah, but it does have this contradiction, as you say. I wonder if that's down to a couple of different things. One is, well, capitalism has contradictions. I mean, look at the lives we lead now compared to people 200 years ago. I mean, you know, this is a great advance. We undoubtedly live better than kings in many ways. We have water on tap, refrigerators, you know. I mean, how often would the average family eating? I mean, I don't know what you eat if you're vegetarian or a meat eater or what, but you know, you'll get this kind of thing if you have grandparents of a certain age, or my dad's in his 80s. Like, you know, we had a chicken once a month, he would say. You know, the chicken, yeah, family chicken for a roast, that was not a thing you could see daily. You know, and of course there are terrible battery farming conditions, but so this is not a great thing. But you know, in terms of what we have, I'm just talking about in terms of the opportunities we have and the material stuff we have at our hands. We are undoubtedly, you know, if they dig up a king from the 800s, we just found the tomb of a king from 800. It's on the news. It's like you and I undoubtedly have more than that king has at our disposal. Whether it's more power or not is a different thing, because, you know, to have power, you need to have a certain amount of leverage over your environment. So if everyone has more, then you still feel powerless. And this is one of the problems we have. But, you know, the point being, Marx says this at some point, you know, capitalism, it creates the conditions for a better society, but somehow they remain thwarted. Yeah, so we're getting both the best and the worst at the same time. The internet, as I said in one book, I think it was the Can the Left Learn to Meme, which I published a few years ago. Can the Left Learn to Meme? And I said the internet is the best and the worst thing that ever happened to us. Literally, I really feel that. And you know, that has its parallels in capitalism. You know, also being having its positive side and its deeply negative side. So there is that on the one hand, and there was another point I was going to make. Remind me of the question we were the central thing we were discussing here.
We're getting at this contradiction between, on the one hand,
Yes, yeah.
coming from
Okay.
your suggestion of a more humble approach to relating with each other versus, let's say, the contradictions of
Yeah,
participating in
so
capitalism.
why do the contradictions exist? Well, they exist for that reason, because capitalism itself is contradictory, and the internet is both a great thing and a bad thing. And then the other thing is, because we think in a binary way, we're always going to see contradictions. So you know, we think in terms of subject object, inner outer. That's how we proceed. This is how this process of identity thinking proceeds. Dialectical thinking is ingrained in us, and we can't sustain opposites very well. They create problems for us. So we're seeing this. You know, there's this contradiction. That's a bad thing. Perhaps it's just a contradiction, and that's the reality. Or perhaps that is how we're mapping reality. Is we're seeing a contradiction of forces. In either case, I think that, you know, that that points to the problem. You know, we see there's this kind of capitalism's good and bad. Then there's this issue of, you know, we think of contradictions, therefore we're seeing we're seeing a contradiction in our being online leftists. But in both cases, you know, maybe we need to be able to be more comfortable with polar opposites and somehow, you know, could you say ameliorate them, somehow bring them together? But of course, you know, on a day-to-day basis, you can't just do that. That's the thing of the binary of us and nature. You can't, you know, live at one with nature, forgetting your boundaries. You can't do that all the time. But we might, you know, momentarily, we might have set aside time to think, you know, there's this thing, the internet, and it's giving us this incredible opportunity to be leftists, but also it's contradicting our very leftist values. Maybe the time to think, well, you know, that's fundamentally okay, as long, you know, as long as I'm working through that. You see what I mean? As long as we hinted at this before we even came on air, but one needs to be able to constantly appraise how they're doing, you know, along those lines.
I think making the contradiction as reflexive as possible, perhaps even seeing it as a positive opportunity, specifically in the context of what you were saying, in the context of the last 200 years, that there's been tremendous progress. We're dealing with contradictions that, sure, they're difficult, but people 200 years ago or 300 years ago wouldn't have had the luxury of even existing within such contradictions. So there's a weird dynamic that's unique to our historical time period, and perhaps that is what will make our life interesting if we want to live into that contradiction. But maybe diving into that specific thread a little bit deeper, I'd be interested to get your opinion on something that is related to the idea of progress in capitalism. So like when you say, for example, we are living the lives of kings in comparison to people that lived 300 or 400 years ago, and a lot of that has to do with the progress in capitalism. How do you think we should be conceiving of progress in capitalism? The main connecting point that I'd want to share here is just what you said about the internet, that it's the best and the worst. And there's something about capitalism here that's kind of similar. Like, you know, there is something about capitalism that's the best, and there's something about capitalism that's the worst. You know, certainly we wouldn't want to go back to, for example, feudal dynamics or slave dynamics or something like that. And at the same time, those dynamics are still a threat and those dynamics still exist. But how are you conceiving of progress specifically under capitalism?
Well, I mean, of course, we have to remember that a lot of what we have, or I guess everything we have, is built on subjugation of people who are a lot less well off than us. So I had to add that proviso. I mean, globally, you're told about kind of a decrease in the amount of absolute poverty. It's the kind of thing Steven Pinker or someone like that would say. You know that, you know, we can prove that there's less absolute poverty, you know, if you're measuring absolute poverty, you know, in terms of, you know, do people have the tools to farm or something like that? I mean, I don't remember the exact measures, but there are some measures which are fairly crude. And when you're saying you're lifting people out of absolute poverty, you're lifting people out of literally, you know, having nothing to having a little bit more, you know. So then they then have a couple of bread rolls a day where they didn't before. So this can be fairly misleading. So I guess we have to have that proviso there, that I don't ignorantly think that everyone's doing much better. Also because you have examples, and it's very hard to verify, but you have examples. Actually, I believe Eric Fromm spoke about this, but of pre-capitalist cultures that had, you know, a high degree of community-oriented outlook, a less hierarchical outlook than we have under capitalism. So I would have to add all those provisos, but still, me personally, and many people I know, we would simply not have the stuff we have now, and nor would the people who have nothing have the stuff that we have now. So, you know, there's definitely a general rising of the level of wealth and security and health, such that, you know, we generally live into old age. You know, old age being like 70, 80. But yeah, okay. So that's how I'm saying things have in many senses got better. But what I'm really trying to say is just that yeah, things are obviously awful, but there's this dialectic. So when I'm saying things have got better, I'm saying also things are terrible. But this is all very relative, I mean, you feel like you just can't be left alone today, there's information everywhere that really creates this kind of stress that perhaps didn't exist. There's this atomization, so it's not like, okay, Friday night I'm going to go down to the bar, or whatever you do. I mean, this maybe for younger people this exists more, but I have students, and I know that students are not congregating like we used to in the 90s when I was a student. So there are two sides, and I think whatever you want to look at, anything that you can look at as positive for capitalism, you can then go, well, there's going to be there's this negative flip side. And in the online realm, I mean, I got into the internet, shall we say, around 16. I had a friend with a dial-up connection, and I was like, hey, let's look up communist groups across Europe. And my friends were like, hey, let's go on chat forums, being kind of forums where you would go and talk perversely. They would hopefully find someone of the opposite sex, and there would be some flirtation. But I was all about, let's go and locate communist groups, or let's go and see if we can find some communist text online. And there appeared to be huge potential, and there was a feeling that hey, because this makes information more open, it's more democratic in terms of information, then the internet is going to lead to greater democracy. But we miss something, and we miss that it's going to lead to a situation where anyone can say anything. I think there's been some bad legislation there, and I think it's partly due just to poor general educational levels, or the capitalist system wanting to teach people very specific things and deliberately not teaching them other things. So you've got a situation where information and the ability to publish becomes very open, and then people will start publishing, really nefarious right-wing views that just seem to be circa 2015, 2016, appeared to be, people just being edgelords, just throwing stuff out there, finding it funny to say right-wing things, and there being some aspects of some of these people actually being literal fascists. But it didn't seem like it would grow very much. But it did, and now we have that in the mainstream of it literally come into mainstream politics. So you have a kind of a nightmare scenario where what looked like it would naturally lead to a growth in at least classical liberal and hopefully left-wing socialist thinking has not achieved that at all. It has done that to some degree, but it's also invited the extreme right into mainstream politics. So that's how you get the best and the worst, but also you get the best and the worst of, like, hey, I can find a Marcuse book online relatively easily. So actually, I mean, where I am in Finland, it's quite hard to just get an English language version or any language version of a Marcuse book, and I'm writing on Marcuse at the moment, Herbert Marcuse. But I can find it online legitimately, or there are degrees of legitimacy. Somehow I will find it, and that's the great thing. But can I sit down and read my Marcuse with calm? Not very easily, because there's always something going on. And if my phone's within, well, it doesn't matter where my phone is. I say if it's within 2 feet or 1 meter of me, I'm going to be thinking about what might be happening in the internet realm. It doesn't matter where it is, because I know it's somewhere in the house, and that's really intrusive. So if you go to the theatre now, there's your pesky phone around, and you might turn it off, but you're still like, when I get out, I'm going to text such and such a person. When I get out, I'm going to see what's happening with Kamala Harris and Trump. So it gives you the ability to read and process. So we can all be philosophers, but philosophy to me means a certain amount of reflection. There's two things happening: reading, okay, that's very important for philosophy, but also being able to reflect. And people are reflecting less and less. So people, they're starting podcasts and YouTube accounts and Twitter and whatnot, philosophy accounts. And it's before they've really done the reading. It's before they've had a chance to be a philosopher. It's not really philosophy. It's like, I'm going to read that because I want to tweet about it. I'm going to read that because I want to make a video about it. Now, I mean, this can be done to varying degrees of success. There are some people undoubtedly who are brilliant, who I've known that they've basically gone, I'm going to read the dialectic of enlightenment, I'm going to read Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment, and I'm going to make an explanatory video. And you could think, well, whoa there, hang on. You know, there's people who've been reading that stuff for 20 years. But I will give them their due. Some of these people, they read it, they read it, they understand it, they make a video of it that is on par with a lecture in a university given by somebody who's been doing this for a long time. But you know, that it depends on the person. But you know, in general, I'm just feeling it impedes people at a crucial developmental stage. When I did a PhD, my tutor was like, don't publish your Zero Books book. I signed a contract with them when Zero Books still had Mark Fisher there. And my tutor knew about this, my supervisor. He was like, I advise you not to write and publish that book. Like all your energies in this period should be on your development as a thinker. He said it's really damaging that now people are expected to, you know, to constantly blog. It was a theory blogging period when Fisher had K-Punk. There were a number of different blogs, larval subjects, speculative heresy, that was Nick Cernacek and Alex Williams, object-oriented ontology, which is Graham Harman. He still runs that blog. I mean, there were tens of blogs. It was a great moment, but it was seen as potentially damaging to philosophers that were emerging, that they weren't getting to spend a lot of time developing themselves. They were required to constantly churn out these blog posts. Now I have mixed feelings about this, because you know, on the one hand you can say, well, you know, you need that time, and you do your BA, you do your masters, you do your PhD, and you don't do much else, and that enables you to kind of almost individuate, but in a philosophical sense. I don't think many people on their PhDs individuate in a therapeutic sense. I think it's useless for anything like that. But they somehow they come into they flower, if you could use that term, as a philosopher. And maybe you don't get the time to do that if you're stuck in a cycle of putting out memes and podcasts and things. However, you know, if you take that line, you lose everything that's been gained, and that is like Mark Fisher. There was incredibly snobbish publication culture at the time. One of the biggest publications was called Radical Philosophy. It's still going, Radical Philosophy. I've published with them a few times. They're run by a few mostly British-based philosophers from universities. Radical Philosophy is notoriously hard to get published in. I don't think you can find a Mark Fisher essay in Radical Philosophy. He told me anecdotally, I think, that he had submitted to them various times. It was like that. I mean, you couldn't get a job in university. Fisher didn't have a job in university till quite late in his life. He took his life at some point in his 40s, but it was not long before that, in the few years before that he got a university post. So you had an environment that was deeply snobbish and very closed. And you know, Fisher's K-Punk gave Mark Fisher a place to publish, and also crucially, like my tutors on my master's degree, and there was some taught element on my PhD as well, but also on my bachelor's, you couldn't get near your tutor. They gave a lecture to 80 people, and then they ran off. They were off, like, you know, you saw smoke behind them almost. They went so fast, or dust behind them. They went so fast. So, you know, I think it's another thing. It's another thing that's a contradiction. You know, there's another sense in which you got the best and worst worlds, because it was the greatest thing that suddenly these blogs emerged. And the point I'm making with the tutors is you couldn't contact your own tutors hardly. They had very restricted office hours, but you could write to Graham Harman, who was a tutor for someone else in Egypt, in American University of Cairo, or Mark Fisher, who was in a further education college, but then ended up in Goldsmiths College. They were somehow more open, you know, and so you could kind of develop this confidence that somebody was taking you seriously. So I emailed Mark Fisher, but you know, actually, if you listen to people talking about Mark Fisher today, everyone was emailing Mark Fisher, you know, and he was somebody who he opened the doors for people like that, because in being a known figure who responded to you, you didn't feel excluded. So you know, I think it's very important having these environments, because then now is you being in the Mark Fisher role. And it's, you know, it's this is revolution, and other people who are opening doors, some more than others, because some people you see and you think they're all about themselves, but you know, it's a good thing in many ways. And I'm aware that someone like you, from seeing some videos, from hearing you talk today, like it's not like you're like, okay, I'm not doing the academic route. I don't know to what level you studied, but you're not doing the academic route, therefore you're not doing this seriously. You're doing it as seriously. And we have to, we have to be very open and clear about that, that there are some very serious thinkers out there who've chosen a different path to the university, or chosen not to be embedded in universities. Okay, I think that was a long enough, exhaustive enough answer. Yeah.
Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month, we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept.
Yeah.
I can expand just quite briefly about my path and then connect it back to what you were talking about, which is just very briefly, I feel like I walked a path where I was constantly holding the contradiction between academia and the digital economy, or I was constantly holding the contradiction between academia and the attention economy. Here, specifically in regards to, I did have a chance to individuate philosophically in my master's and in my doctorate, studying under supervisors where I did have the privilege of having contact with, let's say, world-renowned theorists in philosophy and evolutionary sciences and whatever. But I was also always expressing myself, whether it was in blogs or whether it was on YouTube or whether it was in other mediums, trying to innovate, trying to create in a different way, trying to connect in a different way, trying to create in a different way, feeling like the future wasn't totally consumed by the universities, not because I didn't want to be in the universities, but just because it seemed like there was not really enough space in the universities for the full individuation of a career. And so some sort of the idea I always share is that I've always labored with the feeling like that there's no path, like that there's no direction, there's no way to go, there's no up. Feeling like the ways are shut. And the way in which I've always responded to that is, well, you've got to create your own path. You've got to create your own way. And so I've kind of, through living that contradiction between academia and the digital economy, kind of created my own path. And I do still have a, let's say, a conventional professor position where I teach once a year at the VUB. But by and large, most of my teaching and most of my academic work is being done through Philosophy Portal. So I just want to emphasize what you're saying there at the end, that while I'm not walking a conventional academic route, I do still try to carry myself and I still try to create with a ethos that is very much academic in a serious sense. Like I'm really trying to make a forward advance philosophically. I'm really trying to make a forward advance in terms of the work I'm doing on the level of a professor at a university or whatever. And I do think that there is what you were identifying with the Mark Fishers and the Graham Harmons, a type of ethical and existential openness that people could email me or people could reach out to me, or like our friend David Burke reached out to me, and he's writing a doctorate on Lacan and metal music. And hey, are you interested in this? Would you like to have a conversation about this? And sure, yeah, come on, let's have a conversation about it, and let's start theorizing about it. And so in that sense, I do feel like we're participating in a new type of network that does have an extra burden of responsibility. The fact that we're not in a conventional, traditional academic form. But at the same time, we have the possibility to participate and co-create in something that might be even more intellectually and artistically and creatively more innovative than what's going on in academia. It just is a matter of how we carry ourselves, and how we relate to each other and how we want to build these relationships in a way that are pointing towards, similar to you, I have a sort of an orientation that's more socialist in leaning. So something that's more going in that direction. And who knows what's possible? I certainly don't. But I do like this thinking that whatever we confront on this pathway, it's going to be some combination of the best and the worst. you know, like we're going to have like really great opportunities, but we're also going to have huge struggles and hurdles that we're going to have to think through.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I mean, this is constant. Yeah. This is true, and I think we will always attract that because this is how the human brain works. But I think also people very interested in philosophy, maybe they crave the aporia, they crave the contradiction to some degree as well. It's almost where in any case it's where the most important questions lie. It's like the things that we need to think about, the challenges we need to think about. They lie at an intersection of contradictions. One of the big ones is art and politics. So you have this politics which has to be kind of active, and doesn't really have time. There's no time to think in politics. And you have art which is deeply reflective, and you can think anything, you can make anything, you can portray anything. But the minute you try and enact it, it becomes politics. So you lose that reflective distance. And so, there are centuries old debates going into that. How do we politicize art without losing it as art per se? How do we aestheticize politics without losing it as politics? And of course, aestheticization of politics, in a different sense, has its dangers, because if you're thinking too much aesthetically, you perhaps lead to biases there, which are aesthetically led. That doesn't really belong ideally in politics. But yeah, that's one that really interests me, being interested in the Frankfurt School. I've just kind of decided that won't ever get resolved. So there's something very important in that contradiction, and there are various other contradictions. There's it's a very similar contradiction, actually, theory and praxis. So philosophy versus physical political activity. That's something that the Frankfurt School argued about, and very in a very real way, because you had Herbert Marcuse in America at the same time that Theodor Adorno was in Germany, and they both were dealing with student uprisings or protest movements, and Marcuse basically became a kind of leader of the counterculture in America in the 60s, whereas Adorno called the cops on his own students. So you get this very real contradiction there. Yeah, but it's a similar thing as I was talking about with art and politics. You have the reflective capacity of philosophy, but as long as it remains reflective, it's not acting. And then you have let's say activist politics, and if you're being an activist, you're not getting time to think. But you can't make one into the other, And I think in a way it's not a terrible thing that we have that contradiction. The contradiction produces very valuable, conversations. It produces discourse that will further philosophy and that will further activism somehow. So maybe it's not about getting the answer. Maybe it's what's going to be thrown up by the contradiction that's more important.
That's certainly the ethos and the style that I've embodied. I'll just sort of share that what motivated me originally was this sort of paradoxical inversion that Zizek throws out in relationship to Marx and Hegel, where Marx is talking about more action and change. Philosophy had only ever interpreted the world, but the point is to change the world. And Hegel is much more on the level of thinking and interpretation, staying with contradictions. And I think like the whole riddle or the whole mystery is somehow at the intersection of these two thinkers and you already pointed towards it in regards to when it comes to politics, you lose this kind of reflexive distance because what you think is immediately enacted into a policy. And so there's this dimension in which you're directly engaged in the world and not just sort of this sort of thinking and interpretation, which can just sort of enjoy playing with its own contradictions. So this is something that I think is the intersection of, let's say, philosophy and politics. And thinking through that is at least where I am at the moment. But let's recenter back onto your work and specifically the concept of, let's say, capitalist realism, because when you discuss capitalist realism with Mark Fisher's influence, you bring out throughout the book the idea of depressive hedonia. And I wanted to link this a little bit, but what you already said is that, yeah, capitalism can lead to depression, but it also leads to addiction, attention economy dynamics, and things like that. Is how do you think through these dimensions, both depressive hedonia and perhaps the other dimension of what we've been discussing, like addiction in terms of the attention economy and things like this?
Depressive hedonia is an expression coming from Fisher, as you said. Yeah, I'm just going to go through it a little bit in case anyone listening doesn't know the term. But basically, Fisher said that capitalism in the 2000s, I think he was writing in the first decade of this century, he said it brings about this kind of how can we say, hedonism, this kind of state of fulfillment tinged with depression, or vice versa. You can see it as the other way around, depression tinged with this kind of hedonic enjoyment. And he describes his students and the way they would kind of smoke pot and play PlayStation and eat hamburgers and things. And actually it's one point at which he sounds a little bit snobby there, but he's after all describing behaviors that aren't perhaps that healthy. But he argues that depressive hedonia is prevalent in society. So you have this tendency towards enjoyment. Enjoy yourselves at all costs through consumerism, but this enjoyment never really leads to satisfaction. I would say that addiction is very much linked to this, and actually the word addiction only comes up once in capitalist realism, and it's kind of fleeting in passing. It's not a strong statement pointing anywhere. It doesn't lead to it. It's not unwrapped particularly. But I would say that it's this thwarting of the hedonism, it's the thwarting of enjoyment, where it's never quite fulfilled, that leads to the addiction. And actually, that is borne out by the way addiction works, even for some substances that that they leave you feeling absolute peace. That the second time is not as good as the first time. So I've never taken heroin, so I can't really talk about it with any sense of authority, only what I've read. But that one of the big things with addiction to heroin is that everyone is chasing re-experiencing the sensation the very first time they took it. And I think, in different ways, there's this sense of not being quite fulfilled with many drugs like that. I think with drinking, there are the nights, when you're younger, for people who have drunk or do drink, just like the nights of wild abandon, you're having so much fun, everything is coming together. And then, there are the nights where you have a few drinks, you feel a bit icky, something's not quite working, there are arguments, you're wanting something to happen in the bar. This is back when bar culture was a bigger thing, but you're wanting there to be another fantastic night. You keep going back because you're wanting to have the epic night again, and it doesn't quite come off. And then there's the nights where you just get depressed and pissed off drinking, so you get this with a lot of drugs. And I think that is actually the prevalent kind of state of capitalism, that it's like the classic experiment with whatever rodent it was, where they keep going back to get the nuts out of the machine. What is it? There was we could say squirrel and peanuts or whatever it was. Well, it was probably rats, but there's that classic experiment where basically there was a lab experiment. You had a rat in a cage. I don't know the exact conditions. Let's say I don't know the exact conditions, but let's say it's one rat in one cage. They have a dispenser of some kind of food. Let's say it's a peanut dispenser, and if the rat touches a button, then this peanut is dispensed. So they keep tapping that button because they're going to get another piece of food. And then they do a thing where sometimes it's dispensed, sometimes it dispenses this food, sometimes it doesn't. And what happens then is, whereas if it dispenses every time, the rat starts to discern, I'm hungry, I'm not hungry, I'm hungry, I'm going to go and touch the button and get the food. If you do a thing where sometimes the food is dispensed, sometimes it's not, the rack just gets frantic, just tapping, 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 tapping. And that's what we have with the internet. With Instagram, you could get famous. You could blow up as the next big thing. You could get 1 million likes. You see so many people like going for that, that lottery, taking part in that lottery. Sometimes on Twitter something blows up. You have an unusual amount of likes. Sometimes it doesn't, and in that way we're always a little bit unsatisfied. So there is this thing of like this kind of mania almost, hypomania. We're on the verge of something great, but then even if you get it, the meme post that gets really lots and lots of likes that maybe leads to then a contact with somebody. Oh, I like what you did there. Do you want to come and speak on my podcast? Somewhere along the line, you then get a publishing deal. You're never quite happy because you're always like, this is transient. This is going to be taken away within a day because no one cares about your post that did brilliantly yesterday. That's passé. You can't even speak about a news story that happened a week ago anymore. You know what I mean? So I think depressive hedonia is something very prevalent in society, but I think it's intrinsic. And I suppose that's something I saw as important, that, yeah, you have the whole formula in capitalist realism, as we began out saying, we began saying capitalism leads to depression. Well, that's true, but that's a small part of the formula. And actually there is, I mean, I really feel, I don't think I really put it in the book, that it's not just depression, it's something akin to bipolarism or cyclothemia. Cyclothemia is a mood swing disorder like bipolarism. Sometimes it's called bipolar 3, but it's where you have mood fluctuations that are not quite as extreme as bipolarism. You get a kind of hypermanic state, which is not as extreme as mania, but it still can lead to like flurries of activity and intense emotions, and you kind of lead down on the other extreme. It's quite fast cycling to a mild depression. And I think that our addicted capitalist society leads to this, that, yeah, it leads to depression, as Fisher said, but you have, I mean, and full scale medical depression is a thing in itself, but it leads to these down states, these what we would colloquially call depressive states, but it leads, to then these mild highs, and they very much sync with our relationship to consumerist goods. Can we get them? Can we not? Can we afford them? Can we not? And our relationship to how well we're doing online and the kind of information we're receiving online. So yeah, that's how I would link addiction to depressive hedonia.
It's a really good description of our situation. At the same time, it feels like this is our future, like it's here to stay, and we have to adapt to this environment. And it's a very strange environment that we have to adapt to, because perhaps it's been said too many times at this point, but I mean, we're evolved for a very different environment. We're evolved for an environment of interaction with, let's say, 150 people in physical proximity and physical contact. And now we're in a weird situation, like you're saying, where our social life is kind of like constantly being forced into lottery conditions, like whether or not anyone pays attention to us or whether everyone on the planet pays attention to us. There's always this weird dimension at play. And, what I've always struggled with, and looking back in retrospect now for, let's say, the last 8 or 9 years, I've always been sort of reflecting on my own desire for recognition, my own need for recognition, and trying to cultivate a relationship to myself where I can distance myself from my own need for recognition. Like, I know it's there, but it's not driving me, and I try not to pay attention to it too much, or I try to disconnect it from the fundamental motive of my work. And if recognition comes, it comes. If it doesn't come, it doesn't come. And it's not going to have this huge, overwhelming impact on my day-to-day mood. But it seems so deeply wired into us. It seems so deeply our basic being that no matter how much you meditate or how much you cultivate a spiritual praxis, or how many times you've had your ego dissolved on psilocybin mushrooms or whatever, it always comes back. It always comes back, and it seems like we're always susceptible to these highs and lows. We're always susceptible to these feelings like no one's paying attention to me and no one really cares about what I'm doing. And if I publish a book, what does it really matter? And then on the other hand, you can feel like, oh, that guy recognized me, or that guy invited me onto a podcast, or that post really did well, or now I'm finally getting, it seems like we're really in this oscillation and we really have to adapt to it. Do you feel the same way, or would you put a different spin on it?
I feel the same way to some large degree. I feel I removed myself a little bit from this world because I literally did do that. I stopped running the Acid Left podcast. I ran a podcast with Adam Ray Adkins, who's a poet and artist based in I think he's in Florida still. And we had some moderate success, sometimes videos in the thousands, podcasts in the high hundreds to thousand-ish. I think we have one. It's very much worth looking at actually. If you haven't ever seen it, we actually interviewed Marshall Roderick, the son of Rick Roderick, who does not claim to be a theorist in his own right, but speaks brilliantly. Very funny guy. I think that one hit a couple of thousand. I mean, okay figures for a podcast, and they were just the YouTube figures. We were on the RSS feeds as well. But yeah, I mean, funnily, yeah, it's funny because I speak like this now, and I'm like, yeah, we got these numbers. It's very easy to slip into once you get speaking about these things. But yeah, that's the thing. You measure this in numbers, and we were doing okay, but I just found it kind of that kind of exhausting. We were looking at the numbers. We were thinking, you know, what can we do next to get numbers like that again? You're always chasing that. And so where you don't want to be chasing the next big thing or responding to the news cycle, you end up doing that even if you said that I'm specifically not going to do this. So eventually I just bowed out of that and left it with Adam Ray Adkins, who then himself gave that up. And then I retook the channel recently for Revolt Press, but deciding very much that I was going to go into that just to talk about, what Revolt Press is about, also what writing's about. So we have writers on and we say, okay, so you're writing a book, could be a Revolt Press writer, could be somebody else. We find interesting, what's it like writing, also being a professor, or also being a psychoanalyst, or also being working in a factory. How do you sustain that? So, how do we sustain a creative lifestyle under capitalism? That's really our remit. So we just do that once a month, and we don't look at the numbers too much. That way I can handle it. So I've kind of broken myself away from that, and I've gone like, I'm not about that anymore, and I don't care. And if I go on Twitter and someone's slagging me off, I don't engage, and I've been able to do that for quite a while. And I actually got really flamed. I got really trolled big time a few years ago when I released the book, The Memeing of Mark Fisher, because people just took umbrage that there could be a book about memes and Mark Fisher, and that's not a done thing. And that came from the academic community and the community. I mean, other people who write about Fisher who were very defensive of him. And it came from the meme community who were like, yeah, you can't have a professor writing memes, even though I don't think I had a university job in that very point. But yeah, that was quite shocking because it got into the thousands of people who were trolling me in the space of a week. But I learned just to disengage, and so I've got around that to some degree. But here's the crux, actually. Here's the thing. I have a fairly steady university job now. I went through a period around COVID where I couldn't get university work. I'm not saying university is everything. It's not that I have to be in universities, but it does actually solve a problem. So, it might be easy for me to say that I'm not so engaged in putting content out there. Well, Revolt Press, when we set Revolt Press up, myself and Dan Malo, who's a writer and a lawyer in America, we very much decided, look, we're not going to be looking at the numbers so much. If this grows slowly, then so be it. If we get a cult following and we release 4 books a year, then that'll be the way it is. Now, we actually sold way more with the first book by Bram E. Gieben, who you said you had on a few months ago. He actually spoke about that book, I think. He did, yeah. We actually did a lot better with that than we forecast. But that's a good thing. I mean, why not? But yeah, what can I say?
I think it's important to emphasize what you just said about, it's actually a feature, I think, of people who have a university position. I know that people with a university position and who have always had a university position, a lot of them, they don't even bother with social media at all. Like some of the professors that I had growing up My undergrad supervisor, my master's supervisor, my doctoral supervisor, none of them are on social media. They don't even touch it. They don't even care about it. And so there is that structural relationship that I think should be talked about in the context of whatever form of future political organization that we're shooting for, because maybe it's just because we don't have the institutional or the economic support to really, or even the structures and the supports of recognition to live a dignified life. A lot of people try to get it and supplement it with exposure to social media. And I think that is, I think you've already commented on this, but this is messing up, I think, a lot of young people's heads, where a lot of young people are trying to get that hit. They're trying to get that recognition. They're trying to get that structural support from social media, as opposed to building up a traditional or a conventional institutional path.
I mean, I agree. Yeah, I agree. You see, you seem to be in a place where you understand what's going on here, and you already had your development. Certainly, I know people without PhDs who developed intellectually, and they're not being too much disturbed or distracted by the online realm. Yet, they're involved in it, but they're not distracted by it intellectually. But people are getting into this young now, which is a great thing. You're getting people getting into Hegel at 18, but then they're like, some point a little bit later, should I make a podcast? And I mean, I actually am in a position of having talked to some younger people who are, on this path, and I just felt that, look, you're basically going to totally impede your progress, and you're going to put out statements that are not maybe very accurate, which is not going to be good for you, really. And then you might get trolled, and then you're going to be upset, and you just think that this is not it's not an ideal path. Yet at the same time, what I touched upon there, and then you said that was significant, and then I realized how significant it was. Yeah, okay, so people with stable university jobs don't do this. Isn't that a little bit, they don't get involved in this online thing so much sometimes? Isn't that kind of obnoxious in a way of them? So it's like, we got a stable job, so we're not going to put ourselves out there. We're going to publish books with an academic publisher that it may sell 100 copies through libraries, and we're not going to give any credence and any value to these online people.
Yeah, we've got to work the contradiction on both sides, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's something not going right on both sides, and then there's this whole thing of the academic who, they don't really engage with politics. They only engage with politics to get more citations. So they publish books, and it's a big deal in academia how many people quote what you've published. So, they say some lefty things, but it's only really within a safe academic environment, and to get more kudos there through the citations or on the kind of conference network. But what they're saying really is all involved in impeding revolution, because any revolution would probably ruin their job prospect, or it would interfere with the status quo. But then the online left is like, well, are they not doing a similar thing? Because they level that charge against the academic left, but have they not become like the new establishment in that sense, that the last thing any of them aiming for is a revolution? If anything, they're doing the opposite, because they're just in their rooms. Yeah, you get my point. Yeah.
Of course. No, this is exactly my understanding as well. And I'm also deeply concerned about the point you keep raising, and we both raised, about younger people and people getting into this at an early age. I mean, for me, I had the privilege of not only doing a master's, but doing a doctorate and having funding for that. And that gave me a little bit of a buffer from YouTube, and it gave me a bit of a buffer from my social media presence, where I wasn't really focused on building an online media presence, because I was focused on differentiating internal to my doctoral program. And then after I had differentiated internal to my doctoral program, then I felt like I had something to say, because I did have something to say, because I had differentiated, I had time to reflect on various texts. And so in that sense, I think that young people fall into a potential trap, especially if they're entrained online, to put the cart before the horse, to think that they have to build a big platform before they've really had a chance to tarry with some difficult texts or whatever it is. But it also goes the other way, where I had a lot of people who had only ever been professors in the university system who were actively angry that I would think about ever posting a YouTube video. You know,
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
so it goes both ways, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely get that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say. It's like, I think because there's so many useful people in the universities. I mean, take Ray Brassier. Do you know Ray Brassier at all? Right,
Of
so
course,
he
yeah.
wrote Nihil Unbound, but I think that's a book that he wouldn't stand by or say that's his main contribution, or he certainly wouldn't want it to be his main contribution. I don't think he's actually got another book out, but he writes these brilliant, very considered um, articles for journals, and occasionally you see him, you see a video of a lecture or a video of a conference talk, but that's all you're going to see because he doesn't do the YouTube or podcast network. He's not on Twitter. He actually taught me on my master's, he taught me Nietzsche, and I had a tutorial with him, and I actually then bumped into him at a Wolf-Eyes concert. Wolf-Eyes being a noise, we say, I don't know if you're calling a noise band, but a noise music outfit. No, however you say it, it doesn't work because noise is not music. But anyway, they make noise. Ray Brescia was deeply into noise, and he ran a couple of conferences around noise. And I actually wrote my MA thesis on Adorno and noise. Um, so people like Merzbow and the Boredoms and all these bands that they say that, you know, what they're doing is not music. Actually, it's very complicated. It's a big debate, but in any case, they make the noisiest, you know, audio kind of tracks they can. And Wolf-Eyes a particularly noisy noise band. And I bumped into Ray Brassier at a Wolf-Eyes noise gig, and you know, we'd already be talking about noise because I was writing my MA dissertation at that point in his department on noise. And we actually had this really involved conversation on Nietzsche whilst this Wolf-Eyes was blaring out, I don't know how many decibels. Anyhow, he's a deeply conscientious guy who has time for people, you know, who email him or somehow, you know, contact him, or time for people who he meets and speaks to, and for his students. But he does not have an online presence. You know, you get these people. My PhD tutor as well. But then, you know, that's kind of a shame, isn't it? That they're kind of somehow separate from us. You know.
There is a type of, I don't want to say it gives a different image or it gives this sense of untouchability or unapproachability. I get this image of what you were talking about earlier with the professor who you couldn't really contact, or they just had very specific time slots where you could meet them, but otherwise they were basically unapproachable, untouchable. And so there is, I think, a certain privilege and elitism to that. And at the same time, I think a lot of people create a specter around such figures, right? Because they're, they only, you can only, there's a type of, it's kind of like with music artists, that there are some music artists who are like always on social media posting every day what they're doing. And then there are other artists who they'll only post once a year. Like they'll only post when they're coming out with a new album cycle or something like that. So, it, on some level, it's a stylistic choice. On some level, there's a certain privilege in being able to take a distance and develop a different relationship to your image.
Yeah, I mean, there can be this idea that they must be somehow more serious, or they become more in demand because they
They're
keep
so
people at arm's length, you know.
yeah.
But sometimes that's the case, that, you know, what you're dealing with is somebody who is really a philosopher who's doing the philosophy, not the, hey, look at me, I'm philosophizing. Um, but sometimes in academia, these are just this terrible kind of bourgeois lifestyle. As they do the little bit of reading, they finish at 5 p.m. They're not answering email. They're not in the world. They're only with their family or whatever they have, which is nice for them if they work that out. But you see, I don't know how sustainable that is for many people unless you have significant savings or significant comfort of some kind that you're not pursuing somehow. Um, Greater recognizability. It depends on the person. It depends. I mean, you can see, you know, if you're exposed to them, they taught you, or they're in your department. You know, are they as serious? Are they serious? You know, are they serious or not? You know, in the case of Brassier My PhD tutor was Alex Duttman, who's done a lot around the Frankfurt School, also Heidegger, I think. I can't doubt his seriousness as well, but there's some people who are is very half-hearted. No, it's the day job, the academic day job, but they haven't
Yeah.
got an evening job. They haven't got another job or other pursuit. It's just it's kept very 9 to 5 and very cozy. And of course, that's annoying. And of course, it would be better if some of those jobs went to some of the serious YouTubers and podcasters, and there are some serious well-known ones that would like academic posts who can't get them as well. And I can guarantee you
Absolutely.
there's people who should probably make way for them in a just world.
Very true. Very true. But this is the world we've got. And it's a world full of contradictions, and it's a world full of these painful tensions. And I think all we can do is just continue to live into that. At least that's my approach to it. And as best as we can, either not withdraw from it and try to disappear, and at the same time try to avoid those hungry ghosts in the machines, or try to avoid becoming those hungry ghosts in the machine, to reference back to your book. So I think as a closing thought, and as maybe a final message for the viewers and for the people who have been listening to us for the last 2 hours, what would you like to leave people with in terms of both your book, Hungry Ghosts in the Machine, as well as the rest of your work, Revol Press, and how people can get in touch with you?
Okay, so Revol Press you can find at revolpress.com, so you can see what we're doing there. We have some great books coming out from myself. I mean, it's a book coming out. Other people can tell me if it's great. It's coming out on September the 27th, and I can leave a link. Perhaps I don't know if you put links beneath the videos.
Yeah,
We
links will
have
be in the description.
we have a book coming from Tony Chamas called Liberal Totalitarianism. Chamas is actually One Dime, the YouTuber who many people
Yeah.
will be familiar with. Derek Varn is writing a book for us. Adam Turl, who's behind Locust Review and the Locust Review podcast. So we have some great books coming. Do check us out. Then my book, Hungry Ghosts in the Machine, as I said, it's coming out. I've already said that. What it's about, well, the thing I'll leave you with is the kind of a line in there, which I guess is a kind of like the byline or the catchphrase of the book, is simply an anti-capitalist well-being is possible. And I think more than that, that well-being is crucial to the solution. That socialism needs some kind of sense of well-being, not to be scared of it, because there's so much trash capitalist-oriented well-being, but we need to invest in community and individual well-being.
Fantastic. Well, like I said, I'll leave a link in the description to that. I'll leave a link in the description to Revol Press, as well as a link in the description to some of your social media contacts. So if people want to get in touch with you or want to continue the conversation, should be easy enough to do. I appreciate you coming on here, and I hope that this contributes to the discourse around the book. I think that it is basically pointing towards something mega important, which is not only the dynamics of political economy, but as I hope we've been discussing throughout this conversation, some of the psychoanalytic dimensions of political economy, problems of addiction, some of the personal dimensions, some of the spiritual dimensions of political economy, and making sure that we include the personal, the spiritual, the psychoanalytic into our discussions about political economy, because I think they're an important part of the conversation. So thanks to everyone who's been listening. I'm Cadell Last. I've been here with Mike Watson, and have a great evening.
The next Philosophy Portal course focuses on the concept and tradition of Christian atheism. Throughout the course, we will try to investigate the philosophical foundations of this notion, as well as articulate how this notion practically informs the modern history of philosophy. This will include analysis of transcendentalism in German idealism, political economy in Marxism, existentialism in Nietzsche, psychoanalysis in the Freudo-Lacanian tradition, the theology of Thomas Altizer, as well as investigations of living thinkers like Slavoj Žižek and Peter Rollins. The course will also include live guest contributions from Slavoj Žižek, Peter Rollins, Barry Taylor, and others. To get involved or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online. Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept.